Yeah.
Probably, I would like to. I think so. I mean, it's a bit waffly, but because Stormy Daniels took the stand, and because Michael Cohen is likely to take the stand, and it's going to be combative, and it's going to get ugly, do you think that will push him to the point where he says, "I'm testifying"?
So it'll push him, but I think you really have to exercise discipline in this particular situation.
Okay, so the White House is in full panic mode right now after a federal judge just handed Trump what legal experts are calling one of the most devastating courtroom defeats of his presidency, and the timing could not be worse for his administration. This isn't just another legal setback that gets appealed and forgotten. This is a ruling that fundamentally challenges the core strategy Trump has been using to consolidate power and push his agenda through without congressional approval, and the implications are absolutely massive. The decision came down fast, it came down hard, and it's sending shockwaves through the Republican Party, through the courts, through international allies who have been watching nervously to see whether American institutions can actually hold the line against executive overreach. This is one of those moments where you realize we're not just talking about one policy or one lawsuit. We're talking about the entire framework of how much power a president can claim, how far they can push constitutional boundaries, and whether judges appointed across different administrations will actually enforce the limits that the founders built into our system. And right now, those limits just got reinforced in a way that has Trump's inner circle scrambling to figure out what this means for everything they've been planning. Now, before we get into exactly what happened in that courtroom and why this is such a catastrophic blow to Trump's second-term agenda, let's be real for a second. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They'll give you the surface-level headline, maybe a quote or two from the ruling, and then they move on to the next outrage cycle, without giving you the context, the legal background, the institutional implications, or the real-world consequences that actually matter. That's why we built Politic Insane, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. We break down what's actually happening behind the scenes. We connect the dots between court rulings and policy outcomes, and international reactions, and we give you the analysis you need to understand where all of this is heading. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. No fluff, no nonsense, just the facts and the context you need to make sense of this political moment. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Subscribe. Drop a comment with your thoughts on this ruling, and let's keep this conversation going, because this story is evolving fast and we need everyone paying attention. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. A federal district court judge issued a ruling that strikes down a key executive order Trump signed shortly after taking office in his second term, an executive order that was designed to give the president sweeping authority to redirect federal funds, impose conditions on state and local governments receiving federal grants, and essentially bypass Congress when it comes to major policy decisions involving billions of dollars in taxpayer money. The executive order claimed authority under several different statutes, some related to emergency powers, some related to administrative discretion, and some based on a pretty aggressive reading of executive authority that legal scholars had been warning about for months. Trump's legal team argued that the president has inherent power to ensure that federal funds are spent in accordance with administration priorities, that states and localities receiving federal money should be required to cooperate with federal policies, and that the president has broad discretion to set conditions on how that money gets used. But the judge wasn't buying it. In a sharply worded opinion that ran over 60 pages, the court found that the executive order violated the separation of powers, exceeded the authority granted by Congress, and attempted to do an end run around the appropriations process that the Constitution explicitly assigns to the legislative branch. The judge pointed to Supreme Court precedent going back decades, cited the major questions doctrine that the current Supreme Court has been using to rein in administrative overreach, and made it crystal clear that this isn't how our system works. You can't just declare that you have the power to control how federal money gets spent, when Congress has already passed laws determining where that money goes, and under what conditions. The ruling didn't just reject the legal arguments. It called out the administration for attempting what the judge described as a fundamental restructuring of constitutional authority without any basis in statute or precedent. And this is where things start to unravel for the White House. The executive order in question wasn't some minor administrative tweak. It was central to Trump's strategy for implementing his agenda without having to negotiate with Congress, without having to compromise with Democrats, and without having to deal with the messy reality of a legislative process that often doesn't give presidents everything they want. The administration had been using this claimed authority to threaten states and cities that weren't cooperating with federal immigration enforcement, to impose new conditions on Medicaid funding, to redirect education grants toward programs that aligned with the administration's priorities, and to leverage federal dollars as a tool for forcing compliance across a whole range of policy areas. Governors were getting letters from federal agencies saying that unless they agreed to certain conditions, their funding would be delayed or reduced. Local officials were being told that grants they'd been counting on might not materialize unless they changed their policies. Schools, hospitals, law enforcement agencies, infrastructure projects, all of it was suddenly caught up in this broader fight over whether the president can use federal funding as a weapon to force states and cities to fall in line. And now a federal judge has said, no, you can't do that. And the legal reasoning is strong enough that even this Supreme Court is going to have a hard time overturning it on appeal. But it gets worse. The timing of this ruling couldn't be more damaging for Trump politically. We're heading into the 2026 midterms, and Republicans are already nervous about how they're going to defend Trump's record, how they're going to explain the chaos and the legal battles and the constant pushback from courts. And now, they've got another massive defeat to deal with. Moderate Republicans who represent swing districts are watching this and realizing that they're going to have to answer questions about whether they support a president who keeps trying to ignore constitutional limits. Democrats are already drafting campaign ads that will feature this judge's language about exceeding authority and violating separation of powers. And the base, Trump's core supporters, they're being told by the White House that this is just another activist judge, another deep state operative trying to block the president's agenda. But that narrative is getting harder to sustain when you've got judges appointed by Republicans, judges who are textualists and originalists, judges who are supposed to be sympathetic to executive power, all saying the same thing, that what Trump is trying to do goes too far. The legal defeats are piling up, the political costs are mounting, and the institutional pushback is coming from every direction. Now, here's where we need to understand the legal framework that the judge relied on. Because this isn't just about one executive order, it's about a much bigger question of constitutional structure. The appropriations power is one of Congress's most fundamental authorities. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse, the power to decide how federal money gets raised and how it gets spent. Presidents can propose budgets, they can ask for funding, they can try to persuade Congress to allocate money in certain ways, but they don't get to unilaterally decide that money appropriated for one purpose is going to be redirected to another purpose, and they don't get to impose conditions on how states spend federal funds, unless Congress has explicitly authorized those conditions. This principle goes back to the founding. It's been reinforced in Supreme Court cases for over 2 centuries, and it's one of the core mechanisms for preventing executive tyranny. If a president could just decide on their own how federal funds get spent, if they could threaten states and cities with losing funding unless they comply with executive demands, then Congress becomes irrelevant and the separation of powers collapses. The judge in this case walked through the history, cited cases like Clinton versus City of New York, which struck down the line-item veto, cited cases about the limits of executive impoundment authority, cited the framework that the Supreme Court established in West Virginia versus EPA about major questions requiring clear congressional authorization. The reasoning was straightforward. Trump's executive order claimed the authority to make major policy decisions, affecting billions of dollars, and touching on core state functions like law enforcement, education, and health care. Those are exactly the kinds of decisions that the Major Questions Doctrine says require explicit congressional authorization. Congress didn't give the president this authority. In fact, Congress passed laws that carefully delineate how federal grants work, what conditions can be imposed, how states can challenge those conditions, and what procedures agencies have to follow. Trump's executive order tried to sweep all of that aside and claim that the president has inherent authority to do whatever he thinks is necessary to advance administration priorities. The judge said that's not how our Constitution works. That's not what the statutes say. And if Trump wants this kind of power, he needs to go to Congress and get it through legislation. not just assert it through executive fiat. And here's the problem that goes beyond just this one ruling. Trump's entire second-term strategy has been built around the idea that he doesn't need Congress, that he can use executive orders and administrative action and creative interpretations of existing law to implement his agenda without having to negotiate, without having to compromise, without having to deal with the reality that he doesn't have the votes in the Senate to pass major legislation. This approach has led to a series of legal challenges, and Trump has been losing a lot of them. Courts have blocked his attempts to use emergency powers to impose tariffs, blocked his attempts to cut off funding to sanctuary cities, blocked his efforts to dismantle programs established by previous administrations, and now they've blocked this attempt to centralize control over federal spending. Each defeat narrows the path forward, makes it harder for the administration to implement its priorities, and reinforces the message that there are institutional limits that even a popular president can't just ignore. Okay, let's break down what this actually means because the implications are layered, and they touch on pretty much every aspect of American governance right now. First, understand that this ruling doesn't just affect federal grants. It affects the entire relationship between the federal government and the states. The administration had been counting on the ability to leverage federal funding to force state cooperation on immigration enforcement, on education policy, on health care, on environmental regulations, on criminal justice, you name it. Governors who disagreed with Trump's policies were being told that their states would lose funding if they didn't comply. Now, with this ruling, that leverage is gone, or at least it's severely constrained. States that have been resisting Trump's agenda, California, New York, Illinois, Washington, Massachusetts, they're all going to feel emboldened by this decision. They're going to push back harder. They're going to challenge more executive orders. And they're going to argue that the courts have definitively established that Trump can't bully them into submission by threatening their federal money. That's a huge shift in the balance of power between Washington and the states, and it's going to ripple through every policy area where the administration has been trying to impose its will. Second, this ruling is going to have a massive impact on how the administration can pursue its immigration agenda. One of the core strategies has been to threaten sanctuary cities and states with the loss of federal law enforcement grants, transportation funding, and other critical dollars unless they agree to cooperate with ICE detainers and other immigration enforcement actions. The argument was that states receiving federal money should be required to help enforce federal law, and that the president has the authority to impose those conditions. The judge's ruling makes it much harder to sustain that argument. The opinion specifically addresses the question of whether the president can impose new conditions on federal grants after Congress has already appropriated the money and after states have relied on that funding for their budgets. The answer is no. You can't do that unilaterally, and you can't use the threat of withholding funds to coerce state action that Congress didn't require. This means that sanctuary cities are going to be able to maintain their policies without fear of losing federal funding, which is going to infuriate Trump's base and create a huge political headache for Republicans who have been promising a crackdown on illegal immigration. Third, the ruling has implications for how the administration deals with health care, specifically Medicaid. Trump had been exploring ways to impose work requirements, to cut funding for states that expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, and to redirect healthcare dollars toward programs that align with Republican priorities. This ruling throws a wrench into all of that. Medicaid is a joint federal-state program, and states have a lot of discretion in how they run their programs, but they also depend on federal matching funds that make up a huge portion of their budgets. If the president could unilaterally change the terms of that funding, could impose new conditions, could cut off money to states that don't comply, then the entire structure of cooperative federalism would collapse. The judge's opinion makes it clear that's not allowed, that any major changes to Medicaid funding or conditions have to go through Congress, and that states have the right to rely on the terms that existed when they made their budget decisions. This is going to limit the administration's ability to reshape healthcare policy through executive action, and it's going to force them to either negotiate with Congress or accept that they're stuck with the status quo. Fourth, let's talk about what this means for Trump's political position heading into 2026. The midterms are less than 2 years away, and Republicans are facing a brutal map in the House and a challenging environment in the Senate. They need to be able to point to accomplishments, to show voters that Trump's second term has delivered results, that the chaos is worth it because policies are getting implemented. But what voters are seeing is a president who keeps losing in court, who keeps running into institutional resistance, who keeps making promises about what he's going to do and then getting blocked by judges, by Congress, by state governments, by the Constitution itself. That's not a winning narrative. Democrats are going to hammer this in every competitive district. They're going to argue that Trump is lawless, that he's trying to govern like a dictator, that he has no respect for constitutional limits. And here's a judge explaining in 60 pages exactly why Trump's actions are illegal. Moderate voters, independents, people who might have given Trump a chance because they were frustrated with Biden or because they wanted change, they're going to look at this and wonder whether the chaos is worth it. And Republicans in Congress are going to start distancing themselves, trying to show that they respect the rule of law even if the president doesn't, which is going to create fractures within the party and make it even harder for Trump to get anything done. Fifth, there's an international dimension here that matters a lot. America's allies, especially in Europe, have been watching Trump's second term with a mix of concern and confusion, trying to figure out whether the United States is still a reliable partner, whether American institutions are strong enough to constrain a president who seems willing to break norms and push boundaries. Every time Trump loses a major court case, every time judges push back against executive overreach, it sends a signal to allies that the system is working, that there are checks and balances, that Trump can't just do whatever he wants. That's reassuring in some ways. It shows that American democracy isn't completely broken, but it's also destabilizing because it means that America's policy is unpredictable, that what Trump promises might not actually happen, and that allies can't count on the United States to follow through on commitments if courts are going to block major initiatives. This ruling is going to get coverage in European capitals, in Tokyo, in Canberra, everywhere that allies are trying to assess American credibility. And the message they're going to take away is that Trump's power is more limited than he claims, which could affect negotiations on trade, on defense spending, on Ukraine, on China policy, on everything where allies need to know whether the United States is going to be a stable partner. Sixth, let's talk about what happens next procedurally, because this ruling isn't the end of the story. The administration is absolutely going to appeal, probably to the Ninth Circuit or whichever circuit has jurisdiction, and they're going to ask for a stay of the ruling while the appeal is pending. If they don't get a stay, then the executive order is effectively dead, and states can ignore it, which would be a massive practical defeat even before the appeals process plays out. If they do get a stay, then the legal fight continues, but the uncertainty remains, and states are going to be hesitant to comply with an executive order that might ultimately be struck down. The appeals court could uphold the district court ruling, could reverse it, could send it back for further proceedings, but given the strength of the legal reasoning in the district court opinion, it's going to be hard for the appeals court to just ignore the separation of powers issues and the major questions, doctrine arguments. And if the case ends up at the Supreme Court, which it probably will eventually, then we're looking at a decision that could shape the scope of executive power for decades. This Supreme Court has been willing to rein in administrative agencies, has been willing to say that major policy decisions require clear congressional authorization, and has been generally skeptical of executive overreach. That doesn't mean they'll definitely rule against Trump. Conservative justices tend to be sympathetic to executive power in certain contexts, but the legal arguments here are strong enough that even conservative justices are going to have to grapple with the constitutional issues in a serious way. Seventh, there's the question of how this affects Trump's relationship with his own party. Congressional Republicans have been in a difficult position throughout Trump's second term, trying to support the president while also maintaining some degree of institutional independence and constitutional fidelity. Every time Trump loses a court case like this, it puts Republicans in Congress in an awkward spot. Do they defend the president and argue that the judge is wrong, even when the legal reasoning is sound and grounded in constitutional text and precedent? Do they stay silent and hope the issue goes away? Do they quietly acknowledge that maybe Trump went too far and the courts were right to push back? There's no good answer, and different Republicans are going to make different choices, which is going to create visible splits within the party. Some MAGA loyalists are going to attack the judge, call for impeachment, claim this is part of a deep state conspiracy. Some moderates are going to distance themselves and emphasize their commitment to the rule of law. And the divisions are going to get worse as more court cases come down, as more legal defeats pile up, and as it becomes increasingly clear that Trump's maximalist vision of executive power isn't going to survive judicial scrutiny. Eighth, let's zoom out and talk about what this means for the long-term trajectory of American constitutional law. We're in a moment right now where fundamental questions about executive power are being litigated in real time, where courts are being asked to define the limits of presidential authority in ways that are going to set precedents for future administrations. If Trump's arguments had prevailed, if the court had said that the president can unilaterally impose conditions on federal spending and redirect appropriated funds based on executive priorities, that would have fundamentally altered the balance of power in our system. Future presidents would have cited that precedent, would have used it to expand their own authority, and Congress would have been significantly weakened as an institution. But the court went the other way, reaffirmed traditional limits on executive power, reinforced the appropriations clause, and made it clear that major policy decisions require congressional authorization. That's a huge deal for the preservation of checks and balances, for the maintenance of separation of powers, and for ensuring that no single branch of government becomes too dominant. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day political drama and forget that these cases are writing the rules that are going to govern how our democracy functions for decades to come. But that's exactly what's happening here. And finally, there's the human dimension, the real-world impact on actual people and communities. Federal grants fund police departments, fire departments, schools, hospitals, infrastructure projects, environmental cleanup, job training programs, housing assistance, food security programs, all the things that make communities function and help vulnerable people get by. When the president threatens to cut off that funding unless states comply with unrelated policy demands, it creates chaos and uncertainty. It forces local officials to make impossible choices, and it puts essential services at risk. This ruling protects those programs, ensures that the funding Congress appropriated is going to be used for the purposes Congress intended, and prevents the president from using people's lives and livelihoods as leverage in political battles. That might sound abstract when we're talking about constitutional law and separation of powers, but it's very concrete when you're a mayor trying to keep your police department staffed, or a school superintendent trying to fund special education programs, or a governor trying to maintain healthcare coverage for low-income families. The rule of law matters not just because it constrains powerful people, but because it protects ordinary people from arbitrary exercises of power. So here's the bottom line. Trump just suffered a major legal defeat that strikes at the heart of his governing strategy, that limits his ability to implement his agenda without congressional approval, and that reinforces constitutional boundaries that constrain executive power. The White House is going to appeal. They're going to keep fighting. They're going to keep trying to find ways around the ruling. But the legal reasoning is strong, and the precedent is clear. This case is going to embolden state and local officials who have been resisting Trump's policies. It's going to give Democrats ammunition heading into the midterms. It's going to create divisions within the Republican Party, and it's going to shape the constitutional landscape for years to come. The ruling also sends a message to America's allies that U.S. institutions are still functioning, that there are limits on presidential power, and that courts are willing to enforce those limits even when it's politically difficult. Over the next few weeks, watch how the administration responds. Watch whether they can get a stay from the appeals court. Watch how Republican members of Congress talk about this. And watch whether other judges cite this ruling in other cases challenging Trump's executive orders. This is one of those decisions that's going to have ripple effects across the entire legal and political system. And it's a reminder that even in a moment of intense partisan polarization and institutional stress, the framework the founders built is still capable of checking executive overreach. The story is far from over. The legal battles are going to continue, and the political consequences are going to play out over months and years. But this ruling represents a serious setback for Trump's vision of unconstrained executive power, and that matters enormously for the future of American democracy. Keep your eyes on this, stay informed, and understand that what happens in these courtrooms isn't just legal theater. It's the real-time contest over what kind of country we're going to be and how much power any president should have. This fight is going to define the next era of American politics, and we all need to be paying attention.